Hey guys, welcome to the Drake House. This year I read 20 books from January to July, and I want to do a quick, about a 1 minute book review on each of them. And if it's something you're interested in, maybe you'll check some of them out. So I've had a pretty busy year, but here goes. So my first book of the year, I started just at the end of December last year, finished about halfway through January, was Thomas Sowell, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. I read a few Thomas Sowell books this year. This was probably the best one, and it was definitely a good book to start off on, got me going strong at the beginning of the year. In this book, he discusses not so much economics, he is an economist, but it relates. He's talking a lot about early American history in the antebellum South, all the way ranging to subjects of German history, and kind of some fallacies or myths, I should say, about those that we learn in school and we learn kind of through what's popular opinion is. But this is a great book if you're interested in the early foundations of slavery, or what ended slavery, even from a worldwide perspective. And absolutely an amazing book. And I love Thomas Sowell, so you're going to hear more from him. So, as promised, my second book was also Thomas Sowell. This was a little more on the subject of economics. This is Economic Facts and Fallacies. There's another book I read by him later in the year that I wish I'd started with, but all of his books can be pretty much understood independent of one another. This discusses common fallacies that the American public and public of other nations kind of have about economics. This would be, he briefly mentions the trickle-down theory and kind of why that's a myth, and there's another book I will get into later that discusses that at great lengths. But this talks about racial divides in economics, the causes of crime, for instance, the popular fallacy that poverty causes crime. That's not exactly right, and he goes into great detail of some of these subjects. But again, another great book from Thomas Sowell. If I was going to rate it, it'd probably be my least favorite of the year by him, but definitely one of the better books, as well. So, obviously, I work in an industry that I'm not going to go into too much detail, but if you know me, you'll understand why I read this book, and it's Advanced Vehicle Stop Tactics. Now, this is an interesting book because if you're in law enforcement, they don't really make books like this anymore. They don't really teach techniques like this anymore. This is an old school guy. This guy was policing in the 70s. And I'm sorry, that's not right. The 60s. So this is a different take on policing from a, not a political statement, but from a, like a technical standpoint or a tactical standpoint. And it's very interesting. His opinions, the more political stuff kind of bleed through into it. For instance, one of my parts of the book I remember is he refers to community policing in the way that modern cops would refer to, let's say, the defund the police movement. And it's pretty interesting take. But I actually did learn a few techniques that actually apply to modern day law enforcement. So good read. It was a very short read too. So anyway, not a waste of time or money. So next I jumped into a little more of a political book. This is Douglas Murray, The Madness of Crowds. I gotta be honest, this book, I actually enjoy the way Murray writes, but this book was a little bit of an eye-opener. I actually changed some opinions while reading this book. He delves into everything from homosexuality to transgenderism. It's an interesting book. Not typically what I would read when looking at political subjects, but it touches the subject of political correctness, which is something I am interested in. And Murray is a pretty interesting guy. I started following him back on the British TV show, The Big Question. He was a pretty controversial person on that show, kind of where Milo Yiannopoulos started. But Murray is he's a very passionate guy about these subjects. He also wrote The Strange Death of Europe, which was a bestseller. But anyway, Madness of Crowds, highly recommended if you're into any kind of political stuff related to different groups of people and how they may have or may not be oppressed by our societies. So next is Evaluating Police Tactics, somewhat of a broad title. It's talking about room clearing tactics exclusively in law enforcement. I thought this was a good book because for a long time I've had the opinion, I've been a training officer and been involved in training to a degree for a while. And I would say that a lot of opinions in law enforcement, or I'm sorry, a lot of training in law enforcement is taught from a sounds good perspective, where an FTO simply teaches you what he learned from his FTO and what that FTO learned from his FTO. And there's really no data to back up any of it. Now, sometimes sounds good advice is good, because it is logical. But this goes into raw data and numbers behind room clearing tactics and which style of room clearing is the least likely to get you shot and allow you to accurately shoot your weapon. So a very narrow scope of subject matter, not a very large book, but a very good approach to training, and something that I wish we could see in other fields of law enforcement training. Next is Larceny of the Heart. This is I guess I would best describe it as a Christian-based economics book. Not that the economics portion is based in Christianity necessarily, but it basically talks about economics from a moral standpoint and kind of how we have failed through inflation. And that's a problem not only in our nation, but in many nations. But that is he basically ties the problem of inflation to a moral issue of the American public and the American government. So this was an interesting book, and it's the kind of book that's going to make you, if you grew up if you grew up in this day and age, you probably take part in some of the activities he discusses, and it just brings a different perspective. Agree with it or not, the government steals from you using inflation. They steal from everyone using inflation. But anyway, interesting book, especially if you're interested in the morality of economics. So not a massive book either, but definitely check it out. Larceny of the Heart. Ordinary Men. This is a book about a reserve police unit in Germany. The book goes to some length to explain that these were all ordinary men, and this group of ordinary men became some of the most brutal murderers during the Holocaust, and it kind of walks you through the changes that they went through. And this was a pretty hard read. I don't generally get emotionally tied up in books, but this one was difficult to get through, and I would recommend this book to absolutely everyone. It's not going to be fun to go through it. It doesn't go into a massive amount of detail, like gruesome detail, but it goes into a lot of detail with the numbers, the sheer numbers of people that this one unit took part in murdering. This would be a book I would recommend for anyone who thinks that they are morally superior to other people, and you're above something, and you wouldn't take part in a mass genocide. You should read this book because it kind of draws the picture that ordinary men took part in committing the Holocaust, not monsters. They were people like you and people like me. So, very tough read, recommended for everyone. So, this next book, I have a feeling, is actually going to be the most controversial book, and that's saying a lot because there's some others in here that are pretty bad. This is, The World of the American Pit Bull Terrier by Stratton. I mean, it talks a lot about just pit bulls and genetics, just general breed information. But I would say that probably a majority of the book is talking about dogfighting. And it's talking about it from a fairly objective standpoint. It talks about the rules of dogfighting and kind of how people breed for it and train for it. It's interesting because I definitely changed some opinions about it, which I know is that's going to sound really bad, but if you haven't read it or you don't understand it, it's kind of difficult to even discuss. In fact, among my friends discussing this book, who also have pit bulls, none of us fight pit bulls, but this was controversial. It was actually talking about this with my co-host Smith. This was a pretty controversial subject even between the two of us. So if you haven't read it, I would recommend educating yourself before stepping off into a conversation about dogfighting. So I'll just leave it at that for now. But a really interesting book. Definitely changed some opinions. So not to get off controversial subjects, I jumped right into another one. This is The Bell Curve. Probably one of the most controversial subject or books written. And I'm not to lean too heavily on this, but Sam Harris, who I think is a pretty intelligent guy, I'm paraphrasing, said that he thought that Murray, one of the authors of The Bell Curve, was really misrepresented by a lot of media. And I agree with that. I'll say this. I've talked to a few people I really respect, actually, and they disagree with some of the ideas in The Bell Curve. I question if they remember or if they have actually read the entire thing. I read it all 600, I think it's 600 pages. It's 800 pages, but some of that's, most of that is reference. I think it was 600 pages of content. And there's only about 30 pages of results in this. It's all IQ testing, related to IQ. There's only about 30 pages of like, hey, here it is what we found. But I read the whole thing, and it's pretty painstakingly reviewed. And IQ scientists that have come out since The Bell Curve have said the science in this is still good. There's not, I haven't heard any legitimate criticism. I've heard people say that it's not, that some of the points in the book when it talks about race and IQ are wrong, but they're talking about morally wrong. They're not really talking about the data. And race and IQ is about maybe like that much of the book. It's a very small portion. Basically, the author believes that the stratification of high IQ people is, they are becoming more and more separated from our society in general. And that's going to create a classist system where you have the extremely intelligent people that make decisions for the rest of society. And he kind of talks about how dangerous that's going to be. That's his main fear with this. And it talks about IQ trends in American populations. And it talks about a lot of crime. And one just excerpt from the book is 3 points of IQ. So if the median IQ of America went from 100, which is what it was at the time of the book, to 103, our crime would drop by 20 or 30%. So just as kind of a thought, the median IQ. And that's a pretty big deal. And it points to that IQ is probably a larger factor in the everyday American society than most people would give it credit for. But interesting book. My advice is if you're going to criticize it, you should read it. There are some criticisms of his policies, I would say, but the science is pretty well documented and pretty well settled. But did a lot of reading and drank a lot of whiskey. Hey, have you ever wanted to read a Bible that was written by like an atheist? Because if the answer is yes, you should read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's probably a horrible way of summing that up. But it is basically Nietzsche's kind of idea of a moral code absent of religion. It's interesting. It's a little too tied up in archaic language. If you've read, I mean, Nietzsche's all over the place anyway, but if you've read Human to Human, that's a pretty straightforward read from him. But on the other end of that, Beyond Good and Evil is extremely difficult to understand. But this is kind of in the middle somewhere. There are a lot of truths in it, like a lot of truths that just kind of jump out at you. You're like, oh yeah, that's a good observation of humanity. But there's a lot of stuff that's just kind of just filler almost. I don't, some of the parables are just kind of like, well, you would get more out of reading like Aesop's Fables than some of this book. But it was interesting. I really should have read something a little easier after the bell curve, because this was just, it was like going from one book to another that just really kind of, it wore on me, and it was very hard to get past this one. But it is a good book. So next, everyone should read this book. This is by Boethius. It's called The Consolation of Philosophy. It's like 100 pages, 94 pages total. This is an amazing book. This is considered one of the great works of Western civilization, and Stoicism. So if you're interested in either of those subjects, Boethius was in prison awaiting his death when he wrote this book. And it's written kind of from the first person perspective of a man, of himself, who is awaiting death after a kind of just a kangaroo court trial, and he is visited by Lady Philosophy, and it kind of helps him to put the world into perspective while he's awaiting his own death. It talks a lot about crime and punishment. The takeaway from it is, paraphrasing again, the most loving thing that a society can do for its criminals is to adequately punish them for committing crimes. And anyway, but there's a lot of good wisdom in the book. Highly recommended. You can read this in a day or maybe two. So, unless you're Smith, he's slow. All right, my least favorite book of the year, Breaking the Chains. I really didn't like this book. It was informative. It talks about the end of the slave trade on a worldwide level, and it's modern slave trade. This isn't talking about the abolitionist movement in England, really. It mentions that, the influences that abolitionist movement had, it mentions that, but for the most part, it's talking about the modern slave trade and like the modern world. And it is written by, I think, 6 or 8 different authors, which is why I hate it so much. It's very difficult for me to switch gears with different writing styles, especially in the same book. This is just this is a textbook. If you're studying something for school, great information. But otherwise, I don't recommend it. If you want a good summary, basically, England ended all slavery across the entire world in different ways and in different degrees. And at times they were complacent with it, I would say. But in the end, there is not a force in the world that has more more responsibility for ending slavery than England, with a few exceptions. But anyway, absolutely horrible book. I know why you can't buy it on Kindle, because it would not sell. Anyway, Breaking the Chains.
There we go. So it took you 10 days to read 200 pages.
It was a boring book.
It was a boring book. It was a boring book.
It's taking you.
And you say I'm slow.
How many months?
And it took you.
How many months?
That is 20. That is 20 pages a day.
You have not finished.
You can't read 20 pages.
You've
in
not
a day.
finished the Pitbull book.
Because I'm not trying
months.
Because I'm not
in
trying
months.
to. I'm not trying to.
It took me 10
I'm not
days.
on a schedule. I read at my leisure.
So the
And
next.
that is not a leisure book. So I only take shits so many times a day. And that's what I've been reading while I'm taking a shit. So yes, your book is now my shit book. So next time you read it.
Shut up,
and
Smith. So the next book is, this is the only book of the year that I have read before, I think. Yeah. I read this book probably in 2007, 2006. It's had a new edition since then, maybe two, actually. But it's same now, Inside the Criminal Mind. If you work in corrections or law enforcement, or you're like a prosecutor, I don't know, maybe a judge. I don't think judges really read much, but this is an amazing book. This talks about the nitty-gritty of the criminal psyche. This is not one of those books that talks about like inside a serial killer's mind. This is not that. This talks about this gentleman basically spends I'd say 7/8 of the book telling you that reform is a joke. There is no such thing as reform. And then in the very last chapter, he talks to you about what actual reform looks like and how intensive that is, how difficult reforming a criminal actually can be. One takeaway from the book that I remember is to alter a criminal's behavior without patient therapy is like trying to catch a tsunami with a bucket. And anyway, amazing book. Highly recommended. This is a 10 out of 10 kind of book. Inside the Criminal Mind. Check it out. This is by Jung, The Undiscovered Self. I read two books by Carl Jung, and this one was the better of the two. Pretty small book. They both discuss roughly the same subject, and that is the unconscious. This is more based on the unconscious. There's some things that I guess are interesting. There was nothing about this that made me. There's no life-changing information. He kind of goes into detail on in a way proving to you that the unconscious exists, but it was a good book. I wouldn't recommend it for many people unless you're going into psychology, but it was decent. Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life. If you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, I highly recommend any of his podcasts or anything. This book definitely, though, puts some things in perspective. When I read Jung, for example, the last book I mentioned, Peterson talks a lot about Jung, but Peterson is paraphrasing at best. There's no comparison for actually going to the people he's talking about and reading their books. The same is true of Peterson. If you watch a bunch of his podcasts, you are scratching the surface at some of his ideas. So he's even paraphrasing himself in a lot of ways in his videos. So definitely check it out. Good book. Didn't agree with everything, but very inspirational. But it's not like a self-help book. I guess it is in a way, but it's not like a cheesy self-help book. Interesting book, though. Man and His Symbols, also by Carl Jung. 10% relevant information, or interesting information, I should say. And the rest of it was just mind-numbingly boring for me. Again, a book written by several authors. I give it like a 2 out of 3. It is something you can understand at a probably for the everyman, at least parts of it. But some of it's just, you know, he'll say on one hand something that's kind of profound and like, yeah, okay, that's interesting, and then the very next paragraph will just be like, you know, kind of eye rolling, like, how did you get that from this image or this explanation? So anyway, I'm sure there's some legitimacy to it, but it just kind of seems a little overly contrived. But anyway, interesting book. Don't recommend it. So when I told you I read 20 books, don't tell Smith, but I didn't really pay attention to one of them I bought. This is what it looked like online, and when it got here, it was like that. So this is more of an essay. I read it while standing on my front porch, so I don't know if it really counts. It was only 13 pages. So this is The Trickle-Down Theory and Tax Cuts for the Rich by Thomas Sowell. It's very interesting and it's very relevant. He attacks the idea that there is such a thing as the trickle-down theory. I'm not going to get into it too much, but basically Sowell's opinion is that, you know, all of the economists of the conservative persuasion at the time where tax cuts for the rich was kind of introduced as an idea would tell you that that was not a theory that was, you know, that was in existence. There is tax cuts, and there is a belief that that helps businesses or even the rich, but there is no trickle down. There is only job production, which is a very, very different thing. But there is no, and he makes the point, there really is no theory of trickle down. But anyway, you'd have to get into it. It is somewhat of a semantics issue, but not at the same time. There's also an issue of theories that are being kind of strawmanned or misrepresented. So, interesting book. It would probably take you I don't know, it took me like seriously 15 minutes to read it. But anyway, interesting book. Paper. This is the only fiction book I read the entire year. Starship Troopers. I'm not going to ruin a bit of it. You should read Starship Troopers, especially if you are politically minded. This is an amazing science fiction. It's absolutely nothing like the movie. The movie was a piece of garbage. This is amazing. This is probably some of the best science fiction ever written. And it's very political. And it's very relevant to modern time. But anyway, read Starship Troopers. You will not regret it. Highly recommended, 10 out of 10. So, Thomas Sowell, Basic Economics. This is a massive 600-pager, 800-pager, I don't remember. 600-pager. This is still Thomas Sowell. I still enjoy the writing, and it is still political of sorts, but this is basically a book of definitions. Don't know what a monopoly is? You've heard the term before. He's going to tell you what a monopoly is. Don't know what output and demand mean. He's going to talk to you about output and demand. He's going to define it for you. He's going to break it down in the most simple of terms. Government bonds. I didn't really understand how bonds worked. He explains it in depth. There's a lot of concepts that I wish I had read from this book before reading some of the other books by him. Not that you really needed it, but Basic Economics was a very good book. This is a book. I wish I had read this years ago, because there's a lot of things that, I wouldn't have been uneducated or just fooled about by the media and kind of a misrepresentation of what these terms mean. Like monopoly would be a great example. You probably have never encountered a monopoly, but anyway, check it out. Basic Economics, highly recommended. Again, it's a big book, so say like only for the real readers out there, not like Smith. Final book of the year. Well, I'm still reading books, but final book of this 20, Speechless by Michael Knowles. Without a doubt, the most controversial book as far as my circle of friends and the people that traditionally I agree with on my side of the political aisle. This is where I draw the line with a lot of people, because I've always thought that libertarians were a little bit cuckoo, and this kind of goes into why they're a little cuckoo. Basically, this is, how do I say it? It does talk about language a lot, and it talks about kind of how people concede points through language without even meaning to. Any example I gave would be extremely controversial, and I won't do that right now. Well, yeah, I'll give one, and it's still controversial. The euphemism treadmill of the word retarded, for example. And then there's a whole list of words that kind of follow that. Mentally handicapped was a term. None of the words are any better. They're all kind of they still have this negative connotation. It just changes over time. And it kind of discusses the natural progression of language like that versus when that change is engineered. For example, the word Nazi doesn't mean what the word Nazi meant, 50 years ago even. So anyway, extremely controversial book. Highly recommended though. Knowles did a great job. So, all right, that was my 20 books of 2021. Even though I've probably got about 3 or 4 more that I'm going to hit by the end of the year. And I'll probably do a little video on those. But anyway, if you feel like undertaking something like 20 books, I don't recommend that many economics books. Not all in one sitting. Definitely break that up a little bit with some fiction occasionally. But I did enjoy it. I did learn a lot. And if you don't think you have time to read, you are lying to yourself. Everyone has time to read except Jason Smith, because he is dumb. Listen.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
You're the beta.
Beta. Sorry. No, continue.
How many pages you got left in your book?
I don't know. I'm like halfway done.
Oh, you're halfway done.
Mm-hmm.
How long is it taking you?
I don't know.
Beta. No, you're just beta. You're
I'm
just
not even
dumb.
reading every day.
You're dumb. Yeah, I know you're not reading. Trust me. Anyone that's ever met you knows that you don't
Listen,
read.
you only have so much time while you're taking a shit to actually read. The rest, you got to do paperwork.
Your reading is exclusively bound to your time in the bathroom.
Your books, yes.
Real quick, special shout out to my good friend JB Bryant, who recommended Starship Troopers and the Pitbull book. Amazing books, both of them, and an amazing friend. And as much as it pains me, special shout out to Smith, who put up with all of my arguments that have stemmed from these books, and still maintains friendship with me.
Well, because I realized that you are like the guy in Good Will Hunting that is only regurgitating things he has just read.
True.
And he has not had time to fully think for himself.
Yeah, and special shout out to Amber Bernard.
Why?
Because she gave me some. She read some of these, I believe, that Madness of Crowds and a few others, and gave me some feedback. We've discussed things, intellectual things, not like you. Not like just to
I
put.
don't believe
And
it.
above all, special shout out to AG for
Putting up with your ass.
putting up with me reading above all else for the first part of the year. I am sorry, and I love you. And one final thing, I did also forget to thank Kelly. He actually got me started on this task, and if it had not been for you, then I would not have cleared up my reading list that was backlogged. But I also ended up buying a bunch of new books, so in a way, you made the problem worse. But anyway, it usually I only read about 5 books a year, maybe even 4 books a year. And this has been a good experience to read a bunch of stuff that I either kind of half started or just I would not have gotten through it if I hadn't kind of been challenged. So here's to you, man. Thank you for kind of putting this forward and starting it with me, even though you lost clearly. But thank you. Everyone else, have a good night and stay safe. See you in the next video.